Welcome back to the Sal and Rich show. Unfortunately, Rich is not with us. Last week he had a facelift. This week he's got a tummy tuck going, so he's a bit under the weather. By the time he comes back, you people are not going to recognize this guy. He's got a six pack. His face is looking great, but he's still under the weather. So, but he will return. He swears to God he's going to be back on one of these episodes shortly. So, anyway, I want to welcome Sean Quarmby. Sean, welcome to the show again.
Yeah, Sal, it's great to be here, and best to Rich. We'll see him next time, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. We've had Sean on before, and I promised that he would come back after his book was released, and it has been released, and it's called Room 23. It's a great book. I just finished it a few days ago, and I highly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon. I thought it'd be interesting to have Sean back to talk about this because this book it's a novel, obviously, but it gives you the ins and outs of the Secret Service. So, Sean, why don't we start off with kind of talking about, what the basic parts of this book, because there's lots of characters. I counted them. There's like 40 characters. There's several different plots. Why don't you just give a quick overview of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on again, Sal. And I'm glad you enjoyed the book. Been getting a lot of positive feedback. I think when people sit down with this book, it's a novel, right? It's fiction, but I wrote it in a way that a lot of the stories, especially initially, are inspired by true events that I was part of, and then we start to get into a pure fictional aspect during the assassination plot. And obviously, I got to be careful here because I don't want to be a spoiler, right? A spoiler alert type of situation. But for several years, people had been saying to me, when are you going to write your book? And I think I said on the last cast that we did, I wasn't going to ever write a tell-all. I have nothing to tell. I have nothing but respect for the people I work with, right? Right. And respect for the people I was able to protect. And it wasn't going to be a memoir. I enjoy when other agents, my colleagues, write memoirs. I think they're very informative. I wanted to combine almost my experiences with the Secret Service and tell a story in the process. And you're right, there are a lot of characters in the book because I'm jamming about 15 years, about 12 to 15 years of my career into a 310-page novel.
Right.
So the good news for the reader is, and I always like when I read books like this, the index of characters and acronyms constantly used are right there in the very beginning. They're not at the end because sometimes that gets overlooked. So there's a lot of characters. I was told that it's a fast-paced read, chock full with a lot of information, and also it kept the reader that enjoys Washington-style spy novels and thriller type genres. It kept them on their toes, which was a nice compliment to read. Very fast read.
I think if you've lived in a DC area, or even if you haven't, there's if you've worked on government contracts, there's a lot in this book that I could relate to, like the acronyms. In the government world, there's so many acronyms, and after a while, you forget what they stand for. You just say them automatically. You assume people know what you're talking about, but from that perspective, it gave me a sense of, I recognize this world, even though I wasn't in the Secret Service. One question I wanted to ask you is, how long did it take you to write the book?
If I'm going to be honest, I would say upwards of, it was a while. But, I retired in 2015. I think I started toying with the idea in 2016. I would say 6 years I've been coming and going, putting down thoughts on paper, so on and so forth. And then, ironically, I even allude to it in the prelude, or I should say the preface in the book about how it came about. I was having dinner with my wife and good friends of ours down in Kiowa, South Carolina. And we were taught, my wife is kind of in the world too. We touched on this. She was a Bush 43, President Bush 43 staffer. So our paths crossed. And to answer your question, when we start talking in front of other people about some of the things the exposure we've had,
right?
We take it for granted. But our friends were like, "Look, when are you guys going to write a book?" And that was the seed that got planted. And I finally thought, okay, you know what? I'm retired. I do have a day job, but I can really start to be serious about this. And that's when I started putting thoughts down on paper. So I would say it was the last 2 to 3 years where I actually started recording stories, putting them down on paper, doing a lot of research. And as I think I said to you and Rich in the past, just because it's fiction, and I don't like when authors do this, it doesn't give you license to cut corners. I think when you're going to talk about historical events or events that you were involved in and tie it into a story, you ought to be accurate with the dates. And
Right.
the research involved for this took up a lot of time, no doubt. And I think you were saying it's the historical perspective. We start off in chapter 1 with the title of the chapter is Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
Am I going to take the reader all the way back to Abraham Lincoln and painstakingly bring him to the present? No, not at all. But he's a key role in the story of the Secret Service.
Right.
And the reader will find out how that's possible.
Yeah. Again, most people know that the Secret Service is all about protecting the president, the vice president. But why don't you talk about the original purpose of the Secret Service and get into that? And then how historically, how did the Secret Service become the protector of the president?
Yeah, no, very good questions, both. And not a lot of people know this. So in 1865, Abraham Lincoln was tapped on the shoulder by his then Secretary of the Treasury, Hugh McCulloch. We were in the throes of the Civil War, the North and the South. And the South was doing a lot of really crafty things, skullduggery, you might call it, or spycraft, I call it. And one of those things where they were subverting the Northern economy by creating counterfeit currency. Up to 1/3 of the North's currency was counterfeit at that time. And Hugh McCulloch was the Secretary of the Treasury.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to President Lincoln at the time, hey, look, we need to really address this issue because a lot of our currency in circulation, it's death by 1,000 cuts. You subvert a country's economy or your adversary's economy, that'll slowly whittle away any confidence that anyone on the outside would have in your currency, quite honestly. So in 1865, ironically enough, Abraham Lincoln, I say ironic because he signed this into existence. They were called operatives back at the time. They were largely made up of Civil War vets, law enforcement folks, and legal representation. They're jurists, they called them back then. And they created the Secret Service. The day that he signed the Secret Service into existence to combat counterfeiting was also the day that he went to a play where John Wilkes Booth was waiting for him on the very day. So, people know us, the Secret Service, as protectors of the president.
Right.
So on the day that he signed this into existence, he was assassinated. But to answer the second part of your question, it wouldn't be until 1901, when then President McKinley was assassinated, that the Secret Service would also be chartered with protecting the president.
Okay.
So from 1865, it was counterfeiting currency and starting to get involved in the financial fraud aspect of the Civil War era. And then in 1901, we didn't transition, but we were given the charter of also protecting the president.
So when you find out, take it to today's world, when you find out that there are counterfeit currencies in the United States or anywhere in the world, what kind of action do you take to get that out of circulation, if you can? I mean, what's the process?
Yeah, and the book painstakingly gets involved in this. And the old methods of creating counterfeit currency, I started to see it less and less towards, I would say, the late 90s, the early turn of the century. But it was the offset print press. And printers who knew that kind of, had that kind of skill by day were probably printing outfits. They created legitimate documents, books, even clothes. But at night, they were creating counterfeit. And to this day, it's probably the best counterfeit that you could create out there because it has what we call an intaglio impression. It gives a three-dimensional appearance.
Oh, okay.
These days, yeah, and those are few and far between because these days, 3-in-1 copiers, the machines I mentioned in the book, Room 23, the high-end machines can make really good counterfeit currency. Now, to answer your question, when counterfeit bills are passed, and they're still out there passed in 20s, 50s, and 100s, we don't see many tens being made. But anyone with the access to a copier or a 3-in-1, by that I mean a copier, a printer, and a fax machine, if people are still faxing, you can create fairly decent counterfeit currency. So when it is out there, the end user of any kind of currency is going to be the banking system. Bank tellers to this day, when they count out large sums of money throughout their shift, they're not so much looking, they don't need to look at the appearance of it, they'll have to see the denomination, but they're so used to the feel. They're used to the actual paper that the image is printed on. And that paper itself comes from Crane Paper Company up in Dalton, Massachusetts. And in and of itself, that paper is shipped under secured methods to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing because it has a certain cotton linen mixture that in and of itself is a security feature. And although people can get access to top-notch printing tools like sophisticated printers, they just can't replicate that paper.
Yeah, so it's very, very unique, right?
It is. And most folks are able to determine when something by feel just doesn't, and then they'll pay attention to it. Now, that note then gets sent to the Secret Service, and it gets indicied in our headquarters. So every note that gets turned in, whether it be through a police department, maybe a store or a vendor had taken receipt of a counterfeit note, they call the police. The police take custody of it. The Secret Service is called out to take custody of that note from the police. We go out, we interview the vendor or the clerk, and so on and so forth. Chances are that note is already of record with us down in headquarters.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's quite a process. And that was another question I was going to ask you, because you mentioned the name of the company, Crane Paper. I wasn't sure if that was a name you made up, but it's the real company that does the paper.
That's up in Dalton, Massachusetts. And in order for Secret Service agents to testify, we can't really testify to counterfeit. We're not experts in testifying to counterfeit because all counterfeit is made by different folks. We're able to be experts and testify in how genuine currency is made at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. But we still took a field trip up to Dalton, Massachusetts to see how the paper is created. Because we want to be able to be experts in the creation of the paper. When I say experts, I mean in court. We can testify to how the paper is actually made up in Dalton, Massachusetts. Now, Crane Paper Company, they also produce commercial paper too. But it's the currency paper that gets shipped down to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And I know I have a little bit of an offshoot in the book where there's a potential that there is a corrupt official at Crane Paper Company. And I want to say, to avoid a lawsuit, that is not the case at all.
They're all honest people.
They're all honest people. Yeah.
And so, and this is where my head goes. So when you commission Crane Paper and they sell you paper, that must be a whole process to get that paper down to the Bureau of Engraving, Bureau of Engraving, because you don't want someone to steal that paper. I mean, is there an escort, or is it sealed, or is it flown? How, I mean, I don't even know if you can talk about it, but it just went through my mind. How does that get there without somebody robbing you guys?
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is, there's probably a lot I won't say, but what I will say is that when I went to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down in Glencoe, Georgia, that's where we get your basic 2 to 3 months of your initial training, is down at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. My particular class, we have many different agencies working there, was a special agent assigned to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and that would be one of his functions. And if any of that paper ever and yes, it is under armed escort. I don't know the modality, most likely planes, trains, could be cars, but if any of that paper goes missing, that paper is probably more valuable than the image of whatever denomination is printed on it. Because if you get that paper, you can print whatever you want on it under the right circumstances. And I asked too, being new to the whole federal law enforcement thing, I was like, well, what is it that you're going to be doing? And then I would slowly learn through the training process that part of what his job was protecting that paper.
Right. Yeah. Right. There was a part of the book where you talk about, I think it was in 1990, where the $5 bill had a thread put through it.
Yeah, that's right.
What brought that about, and how does that work?
Yeah, any time the denomination of these notes are getting counterfeited, there's always a security measure being introduced to the note. and one of it was a thread. Now that thread is put in there at Crane Paper Company because they have to do it when they put their recipe together to make that paper. And it's basically a plastic thread that's embedded into a note, right? And it will say USA 5, USA 5 across the whole thing in microprint.
Oh, okay.
Now it's going to take someone who's going to hold that note up to the light to see USA 5, USA 5.
Mm-hmm.
But what I started to see as a young agent up in New York City, and mainly this was a Dominican gang. Part of the Room 23 story involves a Dominican gang. I've changed the name of the gang to not draw attention to me in retirement. But we were seeing that they were taking, and it was brand new, these notes. And without getting too much into the spoiler aspect of the book, I don't want to ruin it. They were able to manipulate the image on that $5 note, maintaining the integrity of that strip. And then I just told you that strip would say USA 5, USA 5. So it was a $100 image put on there. Wouldn't that tip off whoever was going to take that note? But the problem is, people just, you're using money all day long. You don't have time to scrutinize a transaction. Right. You might just hold it up, see the strip, and not pay attention to the microprinting. So the note might say $100 and everything else looks really good, a good counterfeiter. And they're putting it on that genuine $5. And I don't want to get into it, but there's a bleaching process and all that. Yeah. So now you're dealing with legitimate paper from Crane, but it's been altered, right?
Yeah. It's amazing the process that the things that people will do to create a counterfeit currency. In the book, your main character, his name is Quinlan. He gets promoted to the Presidential Protection Division, and just like yourself, there's various components of that PPD. Why don't you walk us through some of the things that I'm assuming that you did? Like you have a first lady detail, you've got a counter assault team, transportation section. Why don't you talk about where did you fit in those, and did you do each one of those in your career?
Yeah, no, again, another good question. So what happens after about 6 to 8 years of your career? You usually start off in an office, your first office, and then your next assignment. Now mine was a little different. I went down to headquarters. I worked financial crimes and organized crime, and I think I got into this a little bit with you and Rich on the last podcast, but what had happened was that about my 7th year mark, those bosses that I worked for in New York were now down in headquarters as big bosses. And no good deed goes unpunished, right? After 7 years, you want to embark on your protection assignment, right? Most people. But they thought about some of the work that I did up in New York, and they thought maybe I could be better suited or better utilized by the Secret Service in headquarters. And I can tell you this, no one ever wants to go to headquarters. Anyone who tells you they can't wait to go to headquarters is being disingenuous, right?
That's the truth.
You might as well accept it, right? So I went from New York to headquarters, where I spent 2 years working for these bosses now that I once worked for in New York. And that we can get into some of that stuff later. But to answer your question, after 2 years there, I then went across the street to the Presidential Protection Division, because our headquarters was downtown DC, literally down the street from the White House. And that's kind of what happens. You start so many new jobs in this career that if you do get tired of doing one thing, just hang on. You're going to be doing something completely different. So I started, and I did the large field office up in New York. I did headquarters, and then I went over to the president's detail. And they start you on what's called the shift. Now, the shift is usually made up of 20 to 25 men and women in the Secret Service on the Presidential Protection Division. And they could be the people, like in Butler, that unfortunate incident. You saw the shift run up on stage.
Yep.
No one in my job likes the term bullet catchers or bodyguards, because there's so much more involved in that. But for that particular day, they were the ones to cover and evacuate the president. In this case, it was former President Trump.
Right.
And, everyone's going to Monday morning quarterback this kind of thing. But I thought personally they did a good job. I really did. Trump was going to do his thing where he was going to make a gesture, but they got him off that stage as quickly as they could. Now, that would be one of the shift's responsibilities. And I said 20 to 25. Well, there was only about, a handful that, rushed up on stage. Where is the remainder? The remainder of the shift might be out doing advance work for the next visit. They could, we do advances a week out sometimes.
Right.
They could be in training mode, what have you. So you do that shift assignment for about a year. Then you go to one of the satellites that you were referring to, Sal, which could be, I'll start off with one of the more elite assignments would be our counter assault division. It's kind of like the Secret Service's version of SWAT.
Mm-hmm.
And their main focus is to be in the proximity of the president to draw any kind of organized assault on the president to themselves.
Right.
So they're going to draw that terrorist organized assault to themselves. That would be the counter assault team. Very good at what they do. As they always say, high speed, low drag. They train a lot. They shoot weapons. They're very, very good at what they do. The other one would be the First Ladies section, a little more subdued, a little more of a, I would say, it depends on the First Lady's schedule, but I was going to say a little more predictable what your schedule would be. And then you would have the division I went to, which is the transportation section. That would be the motorcades. You could either drive the president one day, or you could be out doing an advance of motorcade movements wherever the president's going to go. And I would say that the transportation section is probably the most involved or stressful because most assaults, this Butler incident notwithstanding, most assaults on an protectee like the president are during motorcade movements. Look at John F. Kennedy,
right?
Going way back, but also Ronald Reagan in 1981. He was moving to the motorcade, right? Because it's just the largest site that you could possibly protect is a motorcade route.
Right. Yeah. So the Beast, you had a chance to drive that?
I drove it, but not with the president in it. I was transitioning out of the transportation section. So after you finish one of these satellites for 2 years, right now you've got 3 years invested in the detail, president's detail. You still owe them 2 or 3 years. Then you go back to the shift, and now they're going to use and abuse you more or less because now you've done a lot. You're going to go out and do the foreign advances where you could go out weeks ahead of time and do those advances. The Beast came in as I was leaving, so I never really got an opportunity to. I've seen it.
Yeah.
It is a beast. I was there when the name was coined. I think I got into that with you guys last time.
Yeah. It is unbelievable. I can't imagine how much it weighs. I mean, it's obviously, reinforced and there to protect the president, but I can't imagine what it must be like to drive that thing because it's so big.
Well, we try. I mean, one of the, you don't just go to these assignments. The story was my boss at the time of the shift. We were heading up to Camp David, and this is kind of how the news travels because it's so dynamic. If you got your boss and you're in a car at the same time, he's going to talk to you in front of everyone else in that car and say, "Hey, son," in this case, he said, "Hey, Q, Sean Quarmby, Q.
Right.
I know that you wanted to go to the First Lady's detail. Yeah, you're not going there. You're going to Protective Operations Driving School. You're going to go to Transportation Section." And everyone in the car just started laughing because it's the hardest. Yeah. To be on the First Lady's detail, this is my first mistake. You have to be good looking, right? And look what they're dealing with. I didn't make that cut, let's be honest, but it was just a situation where the transportation section needed someone more than the First Lady's detail. So I did that. And that is where you learn to do that defensive driving. And I never got to do it with the Beast, but I did it with other armored Cadillacs.
Okay.
So you start out working with Camaros and you do K-turns, J-turns, all those cool things you see.
Yeah.
But there's a stress component involved because you're going to have to finish this thing and pass it. And everything you do in the day, and we'd start about 6 a.m., 6 a.m., and go to about 11 o'clock at night because a lot of those exercises had to be done in pitch black. Okay. And I would say out of about 10 of us, only 7 got through. Wow. And for the type A personality that you have on this protection assignment, you have to put yourself out there. I think I've said in the past, anything worth trying, anything worth going for, there's going to be a failure component that you're just going to have a little bit of humility.
Right.
And because if you don't at least take the chance and try it, you're never going to get ahead in this job. I mean, there's going to be failures. So,
talk about Room 23 and because you worked there, and that's in the White House, and talk about what the responsibilities are in Room 23, which is the title of the book.
Yeah. So I finished up the transportation section, went back to the shift where I was only on for 2 years, doing a lot of foreign travel. I did a lot of the advanced work that our protagonist, John Quinlan, goes through when he talks in the book. Then all of a sudden, just like in the book, this is exactly how it happened with me. I get a phone call heading out west on 66. For the DC folks, they know that's, well, you're a former DC guy.
Yeah.
That's one of the main conduits if you're living in Virginia. And unlike most people, I cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. So I had to pull the car over and take the call because I saw it was from my agent in charge of the president's detail.
Yeah.
And he said, "We're going to promote you, Sean." And I said, "Wow," because normally you'd have to go back to the field and then get promoted. And I said, "Wow, I didn't see that coming. Where will I go?" And he said, "We don't know yet, but come see me tomorrow and we'll talk about it." I go see him in the morning. And he tells me I'm going to go to room 23. And I said, "That's great. What is room 23? Because to the average agent, we don't know what that is."
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So room 23, just to set up why it is the way it is, there's nothing tied to it. In the old executive office building, which is one of the large buildings adjacent to the West Wing and the White House, it all sits on 18 acres of land. But in the old executive office building, there's rooms, and they support the administration. They could be security, they could be administrative functions, but it could be Department of Defense. It just doesn't matter. But you almost don't even know because everything is designated by a room. So room 23, room 6, room 8. Some now have placards, from what I understand, outside. So room 23 is in charge overtly of access control. Anybody coming onto the 18 acres, regardless of what business they're going to do, if they're the ones who are pushing the mops, or they are going to go see the chief of staff, or maybe even have an appointment with the president, they're going to have to be exposed to a certain background check. They're going to go through a lot of sophisticated equipment, metal detectors and other stuff. So being on the 18 acres, that's one thing. I mean, you're going to be secured. You're not going to bring something in that isn't going to get detected. But you also may have to go through a background check of some sort, depending on your proximity to the president. That was the primary role of room 23.
Okay.
But what I would later come to find out, though, anything that didn't fit nicely into any other Secret Service component came to Quarmby in room 23. And it was a lot of doing white papers without file numbers. If the president was if you were going to bring an assault to the White House on the president and the first family, or Camp David, how would you do it? And we would set up situations where we did a lot of surveillance of, I was thinking floral arrangements. I was thinking, being brought into the White House. Right. I was thinking food being brought into the White House.
Yeah.
How does that happen? And I'm not going to talk about it here, and I don't talk about it in the book.
Right.
But some of what I found out during those proactive investigations I did at the White House, I was like, this would someday make a pretty cool book.
Yeah.
And one of the aspects of what I found out, vulnerabilities, wound up being what was in the book Room 23. Now, I have to say, that was back in, 2000, 2004. I'm here to say that the vulnerabilities that I discussed in Room 23 have all been mitigated from a security standpoint. Those things have been, and some of it maybe because of the work I did, but most likely the folks that came in after me, we've enhanced security. You're always enhancing security, but at that time, I spotted a vulnerability, and when I realized later on in life and I retired, the vulnerability's been taken care of, I thought this still would make a really good book. And that's kind of where Room 23 came from. So the iftar dinner chapter, that all happened.
Wow.
The standing in that front of that fireplace, that was Andy Card's office, and he was on board with it. And he said, "Sean, I think I have a solution. Would you like to hear it?" Who's going to say no? To the chief of staff.
I'm busy.
We got this. I got it. Yeah. No. So I said, of course. And he played the role that is out. It's laid out in Room 23. That was him.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's cool.
So
it's a fascinating
the most
read.
stressful years of my life.
Oh, I bet.
It was Room 23. Yeah.
Well,
because if you got into the White House and you shouldn't have, that's a big deal. You're not going to bring something in. You're not so much a physical threat, but it could be a character. It could be a blackmail issue. Right. If you got a photo with the president. But go ahead.
I was going to say, back in the day, so this was when we were living in Virginia, and Tony Germano was our neighbor. I think I told you that.
Yeah.
Tony was in the Secret Service, and he took me and Marie and Patty on a tour of the White House, and it was at Christmas time.
Right.
And he just took us around, and it was fascinating. It was behind the scenes. We never went. We were able to look in the Oval Office, and I was very appreciative of him doing that. But I do remember that. I mean, he had to have some paperwork from us. We obviously weren't seeing the president, but we had to, fill out some stupid form. I forget what it was.
Yeah.
So they knew who we were and who he was bringing in. But the other thing that was aside, the other thing I want you to talk about is, and I don't think most people appreciate this part because you get into it in the book,
Right.
that at moments, especially when you guys are abroad, you're interacting with the CIA and the NSA for whatever specific reasons. And there's an issue in the book that you bring up, and I don't want to get into that, but that it surprised me, but it doesn't surprise me because you have to coordinate with a lot of other agencies, especially when the president's out of country, I would suspect.
Oh, absolutely. This is, when the president decides to go to a foreign country, and it's put on the books, we will go out along with the presidential staff up to 6 months ahead of time, and it's called the pre-advance. And that's when every asset, foreign and domestic, that's part of the United States, is put on notice, and they are all going to be part of these meetings that start about 6 months out. And there are no secrets at this point, right? Because the trip is going to be made public. You have to bring State Department in. The State Department then coordinates. That is when the ambassador of that country earns their keep. Sometimes we say, "What does the ambassador do?"
Right.
They do a lot, but that is basically part of their primary role is to maintain liaison with that foreign country in events to prepare for these types of events.
Okay.
And part of what will happen is the State Department will then make notifications to our intelligence assets that are overseas. We will of course have meetings. The advanced team will have meetings away from even the president's staff with just those covert intelligence assets, and we will put a plan together. I wouldn't even speak freely about that or even change things up. I didn't even touch that in the book, but that's what will happen. What I did touch in the book, though, was some experiences I had with what we call the super note. I called it the apex note in the book. Because even when you do investigations overseas, there's not a lot you can do without the attention of in this case, the CIA, and the domestic component here for intelligence, the NSA, National Security Agency. But when we go overseas, you know what it is, Sal? It's the funerals that kill us. When a foreign leader dies unexpectedly, right?
Yeah.
Because you got to do all this stuff in a matter of weeks.
Yeah. Well, the same thing recently. I mean, today's the day after the Super Bowl. President Trump was at the Super Bowl. I can't imagine, what he had to go through, what you guys had to go through to prepare for him coming into town with, 100,000 other people. And I don't know if it was last minute, but it kind of appeared to be. But I don't think these guys had a lot of time to prepare for this.
No, I mean, to the Secret Service, it was considered last minute. I mean, because we would like to prepare ahead of time for that.
Right.
That then turned into, it already was what we call an NSSE, National Security Special Event. And even if the president wasn't going to go, there'd be a level of Secret Service attention and security applied to that site, just because it's basically a national special security event.
Right.
But when the president decided to go, and I don't know the inner workings of when he announced that, it all got ramped up. Got ramped up. And one of the things I noticed, because I was there watching it, I was at home watching the game, he left earlier. I don't think, people asked me today at work, did I think that was from a security standpoint? I said, I think that was from a security pre-planning standpoint to get him out before there's a mass exodus in New Orleans of people that were just enjoying themselves and were going to go out. After the game, it might be easier to get the protectee out of there. And from that standpoint, I think there was one episode where one of the dancers in the halftime show pulled out a Palestinian flag or something to that effect.
Yeah, I didn't see that, but apparently, I guess the cameras didn't pick it up. But I read that today that there was somebody protesting Palestine in Gaza, and he got up on the car or something like that. and I'm sure that put those guys on alert.
Yeah, I saw him being ushered away.
Yeah.
But no, and so I think for the Secret Service's liking, that was considered last minute.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple of weeks, even still, that's last minute.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. It's a great book. I'm glad you wrote it, and I think people will really appreciate it. And it covers a whole bunch of different things with regard to what the Secret Service does, how our government is concerned about corruption with our currency, and what does that mean to our economy. People just don't think of these things, and I think you do a good job of bringing it to light in the book. It's really, really well done. So appreciate you doing that. And like I said, you guys, you can get it on Amazon. It's Room 23, written by Sean Quarmby. There it is again. And you've got the Sal and Rich seal of approval to go read it. We're becoming like a book club.
That's a good thing. Yeah. You got to get the vintner guy back on, who is what do they call those? The sommelier.
The sommelier. Yeah, that was Jimmy Quayle. Yeah, that was a good book too. You drink along while you're reading that one. So
there you go.
Anyway, Sean, thank you so much.
Thanks,
appreciate it, and wish you all the best with the book.
All right, I appreciate it.
All right, take care.